The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If any of you want to come with me, you must forget yourself, carry a cross, and follow me. For if you want to save your own life, you will lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you will find it. Will you gain anything if you win the whole world but lose your life? Of course not. There is nothing you can give to regain your life. For the Son of Man is about to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each one according to his deeds. I assure you that there are some here who will not die until they have seen the Son of Man come as King." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. Well, good evening, everybody. Man, I forgot how pretty this church is. I haven't been here in a lot of years, but man, this is one of the best. You got a beautiful one. I was, like Father John said, I'm down in Long Beach, and today we have a school. We have a Long Beach Catholic. It's a grade school, and we were hearing confessions for the kids, 3rd through 8th grade. So if you're there we were there for me and the other priests for, I guess, about 2 hours. So you end up probably hearing 60 or 70 confessions each. It's kind of a lot. The kid comes in and confesses, whatever, and it's kind of the usual stuff that when you were a kid, when I was a kid, they're still doing the same things, brothers and sisters fighting with them and not listening to mom and dad, and things kind of never really change. And, so then I'll usually say a word or two to the kid, just kind of a word of encouragement, and give them penance. And it's a lot of them, and again, like the sins are pretty much, they don't vary a whole lot, and so you find yourself kind of saying the same thing to each kid. And I realize what I end up doing is we hear confessions in Lent, and we hear them in Advent, so you come up with like a little 30 seconds to say, like each time, every season, you kind of come up with a little thing to say to them. So anyway, what I've been saying to these kids after they speak and they confess, I'll just say, "Hey, what's the season we're in right now?" And they'll say Lent, and I'm like, "Yeah, good." So we talk about that. I'm like, "Yeah, and during Lent we should, what are we doing? We should try to maybe sacrifice a bit, maybe give something up, and maybe pray more than we normally do, and maybe make some goals, kind of maybe break some bad habits, try and make some new good ones." Anyway, like I said, most of them, I'd say 90% of them, when I say, "So what season are we in?" they go, "Lent," because they know. Once or twice a kid didn't know. Oh no, once or twice a kid was like, "Spring?" And I'll go, "Well, yeah, it is spring, but I'm thinking like church season." And the kid will think, and then usually she gets it. Sometimes they just didn't remember, and I'll go, begins with a letter L. And absolutely they get it then. I had a 3rd grader today, so I'm asking that repeatedly. I had a 3rd grader come in, I asked him that question. I said, "So what season are we in?" And he goes, "March Madness." I almost fell off my chair. I couldn't believe it. I was like, I love this kid, whoever he is. Anyway, that has nothing to do with tonight. I just thought it was on my mind today, so I figured I'd pass it on. When I was in the seminary, this is about, it's like 35 years ago almost. I spent a year living in a parish, kind of an internship year. We call it pastoral year. And this was St. Patrick's in Smithtown. And it's a really important year when you're in the seminary. Very hands-on, very practical, kind of like on-the-job training. The first couple of years you're in the classroom, all academic, theoretical stuff, and then finally you get out into the trenches where it really matters. You're living in the rectory, so that's a new experience. So you really kind of get a sense of what it's going to be like. So for a lot of guys, it's kind of a make or break year. For me, it really was. I loved it, and after that year, I kind of knew, like, yeah, this is what I want to do. Other guys, not. They may have had a real good year, but they just kind of realized along the way, I just don't think God really wants me to do this or is calling me to do it. But in any case, it was a great experience for me. I was very lucky. It was a really awesome parish, and I had really great priests that I was living with. The pastor at the time was a really wonderful guy. His name was Father Paul Walsh. Eventually, he became a bishop. The other priest was a newly ordained, kind of like Father John. His name is Father Barr. He was a great guy. He also became a bishop. So clearly, I must be doing something wrong because but they were just great examples to me, these guys, about, just being a good priest. So I'm grateful forever to them and to St. Patrick's for that year. The pastor, this guy, Father Walsh, he loved music. Big music guy. Whenever I'd walk past his room in the rectory, he'd always be cranking music. I could hear it in his room. It wasn't really my kind of music. It was like, Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby, Dean Martin. I was 24 at the time, so I was like not really loving the crooners. I kind of like them now, but back then I didn't have much use for it. That year, and then in like subsequent years, what he used to do, Father Walsh, was he'd get tickets whenever anybody big was performing here on the island. He'd buy tickets, and he'd always get me a ticket, and I never really wanted to go, but I just kind of, I loved him, and so I'd go. Usually it was Westbury Music Fair. So we saw Perry Como, Tony Bennett, Andy Williams. It was kind of like going to a concert in a nursing home, to be honest with you. I was like the youngest guy there by like 30 years. I never really wanted to go so much. But I'm telling you, every time I did, I was glad I did. These guys were great. Now, many years later, I really do appreciate those guys. They were great. They were still great, even though they were in the kind of the final years of their careers. They were all kind of old guys at that point. Anyway, without realizing it, I kind of continued that tradition, kind of seeing these entertainers who once were really big, but now are kind of in like the twilight of their career. I just found myself kind of seeing people whose music I liked, but like they were real big years before. I think I've probably seen the Beach Boys a dozen times over the years between Jones Beach and Westbury and even some bigger venues. Frankie Valli, I've seen him. So Simon and Garfunkel, one of their reunion tours. And kind of my thinking is, there are just some performers out there who, if you can see them, you should. Before they die, in a sense. But they're so great. They achieved such success. Like you ought to see them if you can, even if they're not quite what they once were and they can't, hit the notes maybe the way they once did. There's still some real power in it. About 4 years ago, I saw Don McLean in concert. He's now about 78 or 79 years old. But I was thinking, he was playing at Westbury, and I was thinking, man, this guy wrote American Pie. Like, to hear American Pie live by the guy who wrote it, like, you gotta go. And I went, and it really was a great night. And again, his voice isn't, you hear the recordings from albums from the 1970s. Of course, his voice isn't what it once was. But it was still a great night. We were all waiting for American Pie. We were like, he's got to play it. He's got to play it. And he did. He didn't disappoint. He's got some other great songs, Don McLean, some of which I knew, and there's some others that I didn't know, which really made the night particularly memorable. Kind of hearing about these other songs. He's got one called Vincent. That one I knew. I think most of you probably know it, if you heard it. But I never really listened to it. I heard it a million times on the radio, but I never really listened to the words until that concert. And before he sang it, he talked about it, and why he wrote it. He talked about what was going on in his life. This is back in the early 70s when he wrote it. It's about Vincent van Gogh, the artist, the painter. And it's about his terribly troubled life. He was severely mentally ill, this poor guy. And again, this is 100 and however many years ago when we knew so little about mental illness, and the prospects of medication and treatment today. That was all foreign then. So you were just considered a nut. You were just considered a crazy person. And he was. That's what he was seen as. He's now considered one of the most influential figures of Western art, right? Van Gogh. But during his life, he had almost no commercial success. It all happened pretty much after he died. People discovered him. He ultimately took his own life. He was so tormented emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. Just tormented by mental illness. He was misunderstood. He wasn't appreciated, like I said, until, sadly, he was gone. He was like the classic tortured artist. Don McLean, when he was introducing the song, he talked about his life at that time. And he was young. He was in his 20s. This was 1970, actually. And he said his life was not good. His marriage was breaking up. He was broke. His first album was a commercial flop. So he started reading this biography of Van Gogh. He found it. Somebody had it, and he just picked it up and just started reading it and felt kind of this connection to this guy. And he wasn't saying he was Van Gogh, but he kind of related to... He just saw parallels. Don McLean, if you listen to him in interviews, he's kind of a dark guy. He's very honest, but I think he's probably kind of a mildly depressed person. This is what he said about that point in his life. Don McLean, he said, "I was in a bad marriage that was killing me. I was tortured. It wasn't as bad off as Vincent was, but I was in a dark place." He says, no matter how happy or hopeful I am, I always tend to drift back to the sadness. It's underneath all the music I've ever written. Sad songs, beautiful. Like some beautiful in epic ways, but sad. Even American Pie, kind of a sad song. We all love it. Everybody dances and sings to it, right? But it's a song about loss. Loss of innocence, end of an era, death in a sense. And he said he was up in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and he had these prints of these famous Van Gogh paintings. And he put them up so he could see them, and he's got his guitar, and he's got a pen, and he's like reading the book, and he's writing lyrics, and he wrote this just beautiful song. Tonight, tomorrow, give it a listen. Vincent. It's about this particular, maybe his most famous, called Starry Night. Van Gogh wrote it when he was in a mental hospital. Like his life had come undone. He had come apart. But they say in like this period of uniquely, awful psychological pain, he created some of his greatest, masterpieces. It's like sometimes in the darkest of days, beauty is born. Isn't it? It was for Van Gogh. It kind of was for Don McLean. In this unhappy, terrible moment in his life, he wrote American Pie. And then this particular song, truth and beauty being born out of darkness. These are some of the lyrics to the song. It's almost like Don McLean is talking to Vincent van Gogh. He goes, "Now I understand what you tried to say to me, how you suffered for your sanity, how you tried to set them free. They would not listen, they did not know. Perhaps they'll listen now." So from suffering, from our crosses, comes beauty, comes truth. I think it really does. I don't think Jesus would have been telling us, hey, you want to follow me, find yourself a cross and get ready to carry it, if he didn't see some value and purpose to it. As painful and as difficult as the cross moments in life are. So from a cell in an insane asylum in France in 1887, Starry Night is created, like this thing of beauty. From darkness and maybe rejection, depression, beauty and truth is born. In 1968, April of 1968, Robert Kennedy was in Indianapolis. He was campaigning for the president, running for president. That was the day that, this particular day in April, Martin Luther King had been killed. And he was getting ready that night to deliver a speech, campaign speech, in this inner city part of Indianapolis, completely African-American community. And the people didn't know yet. It's 1968. We didn't have cell phones. You didn't hear stuff, obviously, the way you do today. So the people had not yet, they didn't know that he had even been shot, let alone was dead. So the Kennedy group was like, what are we going to do here? His people wanted him to cancel it because they were concerned about rioting. But he said no. He said he wasn't going to cancel. There were safety concerns for him, and he was like, I don't care. I'm not going to not do this. It was a great moment. It's YouTube this. So check out Vincent and Google RFK, MLK assassination speech. It's inspiring. He gets up on the back of a pickup truck. And they said just a few minutes before this, he's in the back seat of the car, and he's like writing up these notes. And he gave this impromptu, amazing speech. And he announced it to the people, and you hear people starting to scream and like sob in this audience. He talked about his own brother's death 5 years before and the suffering that it caused. And then he quoted a poem from this ancient Greek playwright, Aeschylus. Is that how you say it? Anybody know? Who cares? Aeschylus, we'll say it's. Anyway, he wrote these Greek tragedies. And this is what Bobby Kennedy mentioned on this pickup truck to these grieving people who had just lost their hero. He said, "In our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." There was no rioting in Indianapolis that night. There was throughout many of the cities of the country. But there was nothing that night. And they say it was because his words, his truthful words, I'd say even his beautiful words, kind of healed these people. Man, it's like this whole darkness light thing, this whole awful moment in life, and from it comes truth. It's all this cross stuff. 5 weeks ago, we all got our ashes and we walked around town or wherever we were with a cross on our forehead. We're so used to doing that, we don't think much about it, but you kind of let's step out of our Catholic selves for a minute. It's kind of a bizarre thing to do. Like you're walking around and you got this thing on your forehead, ashes. It must be a big deal. Not the ashes, but the cross. And what it represents and what it symbolizes and what comes from it, if we allow it to. So Don McLean, are you saying that beauty is sometimes born of pain? I think he was. I think he does. Vincent van Gogh, is that what happened when you were in that mental hospital and you were painting these like once-in-a-lifetime works of art? I think he'd say yes. I think that's what crosses do, if we let them, and if we don't run from them, and if we don't shield people from them. I'm not saying we should go looking for crosses, but he told us not to run from them. And our instinct, or at least mine is to run from them. I used to be, years ago, I was chaplain at St. Anthony's High School, about 25 years ago. And I got this letter, this is a couple of years ago now, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, from a grad kid that I knew. I didn't even know him that well, actually, back then. But he called me, he was engaged, and he asked me if he tracked me down, and he asked me if I'd be able to do his wedding. So it turned out I wasn't able to do it. I felt bad. I forget what the conflict was, but I think it was out east, and I couldn't, it was going to be too much. So I just said, yeah, I don't think I can. I said, let me check, but I'm pretty sure I can't. And he was very okay with it. Anyway, about a week later, he writes me this letter. Hey, Father Brian, it was great talking to you last week. I really appreciate you trying to rearrange things for the wedding, but totally understand that you won't be able to make it. It would have been great to have had you. Our conversation got me thinking about my high school years and some of the people who helped me through difficult days. Maybe it's the upcoming wedding that's got me in a more reflective mood, but I just wanted to thank you for being on the scene when I was a kid. He was a transfer student. I think he came in, I think his sophomore year. And he was having a very tough time. His father was transferred to New York. He wasn't from here. The kid knew nobody. So just picture that, going into a high school midway, not knowing a soul. He was depressed, like he was really struggling. And he confided in one of his teachers one day. She could tell something was up with him. He just was clearly not in a good place. And he kind of broke down and opened up, and he just talked about how unhappy he was, and how much he hated St. Anthony's and hated Long Island. And he wanted to be back wherever he lived. I don't even remember. And he kind of felt hopeless. Anyway, this teacher thought it might not be a bad idea to connect he and I. So she did, and we ended up meeting up in my office one day. And the worst part of his day, he said, was the morning, because his bus would get to school early. And anybody whose bus got to school early, you always go to the cafeteria. Most kids. You kind of had cafeteria was open, and you just hang there. But he said that was worse than anything, because he was sitting alone. You're 15 years old in a high school cafeteria, sitting alone. Like, what's worse than that? He couldn't stand it. So we're talking, and I told him that we had Mass in the morning. I said, why don't you come up to Mass? Anyway, let me get back to the letter here. He says, I've been thinking about that first semester at St. Anthony's, my sophomore year. That was by far one of the darkest periods of my life. Having to move at 15 to a place where I knew no one was beyond brutal. They were very lonely and depressing months. Actually, it was more like a lonely, depressing year. Having to leave my friends was incredibly tough, and trying to make new ones was even worse. I remember your invitation to morning Mass, and honestly thinking, how is going to Mass going to help me? I wanted no part of it. But the prospect of sitting alone in the cafeteria before school was worse than the prospect of going to Mass. So I gave it a try. I'm so glad I did. At first it was just a place to hide and not feel so alone. But eventually I began to like it. I just felt at peace in the chapel, and there was a strange power in being with other kids my age, even if I didn't know them. But then, as you know, I did get to know them. Some became friends that I'll have forever. By graduation, the sadness I felt at leaving St. Anthony's was greater than the fear and loneliness I felt when I started. And that was hard to believe. He met the girl he was going to marry, he met in college at University of Scranton. So he says this, her name was Katie. He said, I met Katie in college. And as I'm sure you remember, Scranton wasn't my first pick. I remember being in your office when I got waitlisted at Boston College. I thought it was the end of the world. Well, if I had made BC, that's where I would have gone. And there's no reason to think I'd have ever met Katie. And now I can't imagine life without her. Sometimes God seems to show up in the darkest and most unexpected places. I guess the challenge for us is to remember that when we're in those dark places. Eventually, there's meaning. My years at St. Anthony's taught me that. And I just wanted to say thanks. Well, needless to say, I did that kid's wedding. I changed my plans. You know, it's just this notion of like the worst of time. Out of the worst of times comes the best. Or at least some light. Maybe not the best. And maybe it's a chapter that you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. I get it. And it's a chapter you'd never want to revisit again. I get that. But it wasn't meaningless. If we're people of faith, if we're people who believe in this cross thing, Like I said, I've got a school where I am. I'm still in touch with a couple of St. Anthony's teachers from years ago. It's interesting, when I talk to teachers who've been around for a while, I'll ask them, is it still as much fun as it used to be? And most of them say no. It's really not. They said being in the classroom itself, yeah, that's still, they still love that. But what makes the job much less fun, they say, is the parents. The parents are just brutal today. And they weren't 25 years ago. And they definitely weren't 50 years ago. He said all they do today is protect their kids. They cover for their kid. They make excuses. They intervene way more than they should. Asking teachers for makeup exams, second chances, all the time. Sometimes lying for their kids. That's not a good thing. And I think there's a spiritual proof of that. Jesus wasn't shielded. God the Father didn't shield Jesus from the cross. As agonizing as it must have been, Jesus didn't get a get out of jail free card. Jesus had to endure Good Friday. So when we try to erase Good Fridays all the time, especially the people we love, I get why our instinct is to do it, but I think we got to override it. Because sometimes that's just what's needed. I was out with my mom not too long ago. My mom's now 80, she's going to be 89 in a month. She's always telling me to stop telling people how old she is, but... And I said to her, hey, Mom, we were talking about growing up, and I was talking about this stuff. And I said, you know what? I said, when we were kids, when we got in trouble, like a teacher called from home, or a coach, or the neighbor across the street, I said, we were always presumed guilty. And she said, yeah. And I said, why? She says, because you were guilty. Like, you were 9.5 times out of 10, you were guilty. I wasn't going to say you weren't when you were. And I asked her, I said, you and Dad, you never seemed that interested in being our friend. And she looked up at me and she said, no. And I said, why? She said, because we had friends. Like, our job wasn't to be your friend. I was your mom. He was your dad. When's the last time you punished a friend? When's the last time you grounded a buddy? It's like, look at yourself like the built-in conflict. Hey, now we're all adults. I think my siblings and my mom, we kind of are friends. God, not when I was 15. We weren't enemies most of the time, but they were okay at times even then, if they were the enemy, if they were the bad guy, because that's what we needed. We needed the cross of that. So I'd ask you tonight just to think about this, reimagine your crosses. Think for a moment now about your darkest chapters. The heaviest crosses you've ever had to carry. I'd ask you to reimagine them, if you haven't already. And I suspect many of you already have. And like I said, you wouldn't want to revisit it. And I'm not suggesting you do. Crazy people pursue crosses. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's part of life. Forget what I'm saying. He said it. It's a part of life. So don't run from them. Don't jump in front of them to protect somebody else. Because it's probably just what they need. because something true and great and beautiful will come from it. But you gotta sit in Good Friday. In order to know Easter Sunday, there's gotta be a Good Friday. I'm not saying deny the weight of the cross. I'm not saying make little of the pain. I'm really not. That'd be an insult. I'm just saying look for the beauty. Is there beauty to be found? Just look for the beauty.